Right. The next slide is on really an update on the global economy up to the present. And this is about the global financial crisis and what I term here the shift to the east. So the next chapter after that second phase of reglobalization is really the onset of this global financial crisis and what has happened in its wake. So what we saw was a financial crisis brewed very much in the West, in the United States and Western Europe, which spread around the world. It led to a sharp contraction of growth. I have a couple of charts to tell this tale. The biggest contraction of growth since the end of the Second World War. And not only a contraction of growth, but a deglobalization as well, because we saw a big contraction in international trade, the biggest contraction since the Great Depression, a contraction in foreign direct investment, and in capital flows around the world. So that also was testament to no decoupling happened. This affected the whole world, not just the West. But as interesting is a differential story in terms of how the crisis had an impact on different parts of the world and what happened thereafter. Because if you look at the same charts, what you see is that developing countries, and this was particularly so in East and South Asia, had not as sharp a contraction as in the West. They had a quicker rebound and also a healthier, a stronger rebound to growth than was the case in the West. And a core reason for this, outside the West, particularly in Asia, balance sheets were healthier of governments and of banks and of individuals and households. So they didn't have a financial crisis. They had a trade crisis because their key markets in the West had contracted. But because they didn't have a financial crisis, it didn't take them as long to bounce back. The West is still very much lumbered with huge levels of debt at the level of governments, at the level of companies, and at the level of households. For example, there's another chart here that shows that developing countries, on the whole, have a public debt to GDP burden of about 25%, whereas it's 100% or thereabouts in the advanced countries. And what we have seen since the GFC is that outside the West, particularly the healthier emerging markets, have grown much faster than the West itself. I have a couple of charts again here to show that point. Between 2007 and 2012, we see China growing in real terms by about 60%. China continued to have 8 to 10% rates of growth. India grew by about 40%. India, until about 3 years ago, continued to have about 8% rates of growth. But the West grew by only 2%. Now, what that tells us is that there's been an increasing divergence of short-term economic performance, but what that does in the process is accelerate the convergence of developing countries, particularly the faster growing emerging markets, with the West. So short-term divergence accelerating longer-term convergence. But, and this is the final twist to this tale, what we have seen in the last couple of years is an emerging market slowdown. So in the key emerging markets that were growing very fast, we have seen a considerable slowing down of growth. China now to 7% officially, probably much less than that unofficially or really. India also 5% or thereabouts. Brazil now heading into recession with flat growth the last couple of years, and Russia with what looks like a free fall in its economy at the moment. And curiously, it is the United States, which is the economy in the world that's doing better at the moment, as it's rebounding faster than elsewhere, while Europe and Japan still remain very much stuck in the doldrums. So the United States, at least for the moment, is re-emerging as the growth motor of the world economy, although not nearly as powerful a motor as it was in the 1990s. And that leads me to my final slide, which tries to put all of what I've said so far about reglobalization in those two phases, about evaluating globalization today to what it was like in the 19th century, into a broad and updated international political framework, which is where I started. So I started with the beginning of the Pax Americana, that high point of US power, the post-war liberal international economic order, Smith abroad, Keynes at home, and the new institutions that the United States created. So what's happened since then, and what is the state of play? Well, that high point of American hegemony lasted until the 1960s, when the United States remained pretty much uncontested. And it displayed clear-cut leadership in every international regime. And indeed, it acted unilaterally or bilaterally when it couldn't act in the way it thought most effectively through those international regimes. The most notable example of that was the Americans unilaterally giving Marshall aid for the reconstruction of recovery of Europe from the late 1940s. It did that outside the World Bank in particular. But from the mid to late 1960s, I guess, we see the relative, not the absolute, but the relative decline of US power, in the sense that other countries and regions rise, inevitably so, with a prospering world economy. So we see Western Europe and Japan going past their reconstruction and recovery phase to healthy growth, and thereby narrowing the gap, converging somewhat with the United States. We see the Western countries, including the United States, come under more competition from labor-intensive exports from the East Asian tigers. So in other words, the environment is becoming more competitive. And as it becomes more competitive, and at the same time, the United States dips into a more pessimistic mood, and indeed mode, with stagflation, with the Vietnam War and the Watergate crisis. And by this stage, the United States feels more of the stresses and strains of leadership in the global economy. So it is linked to the gold standard. It can't devalue the dollar, while other countries can devalue their countries' currencies and thereby gain export advantage. The Americans have their hands tied. Similarly, in trade, the American market is broadly open, but other countries remain very protectionist. The United States begins to chafe more at these restrictions and push against them. So it moves off gold in 1971, it smashes Bretton Woods, and it insists by this stage, and particularly come the 1980s, on other countries opening up their markets more. In other words, it starts to insist on what trade economists call symmetrical reciprocity. I will only open my market if you open your market to an equivalent extent. That was roughly the situation in trade and finance. Then we come to a sort of intermediate phase, come the late 1980s and through the 1990s. So the Soviet Union collapses, the Cold War is at an end, and we are at a so-called unipolar moment in history, where the United States is the uncontested great power or superpower. And the United States manifests that in different ways. It is the global policeman on security issues, That reached its high point with the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. And on economic issues, we see that American leadership as well. It was the Americans who very much led the bailouts of Mexico and then later of Brazil and even Russia, and who orchestrated the IMF actually providing bailout packages to these countries. In other areas like international trade, leadership was more shared because the gap wasn't so big. So on trade was effectively a dual leadership of the United States and the European Union. They were the ones who brought the Uruguay round to a close and who led the WTO in its early years at least. But come the early 21st century, we see much greater multipolarity in the world economy. So it's no longer just the United States with Europe or say Japan, the so-called triad. But we see, of course, in particular the rise of China, to the extent that China is now at purchasing power, the biggest economy in the world. It's the biggest trading nation in goods in the world. It's the biggest emitter of carbon in the world. It's the biggest importer of commodities in the world, and so on. And all of this has happened in remarkably quick time. We've seen the rise of other developing country powers as well, such as India, Brazil, Indonesia, also Russia. In other words, greater multipolarity. And if we look at how this is played out in different areas of international economic policy, we see the difference from previous eras. So let's take trade. The United States has conspicuously not led in the WTO the way it used to lead in the GATT. It's been distracted with FTAs for the most part instead. Europe and Japan have also shown very little leadership. Europe because of its own divisions, and Japan because it was in two lost decades after its financial bubble burst in 1989. In finance, again, we see much less confidence in American leadership in the IMF and elsewhere. We see that in other issue areas like environment and climate change, even energy. So the United States is not leading the way it used to. And if anything, that's been exacerbated by the GFC, because since then, of course, the United States economy has been in the doldrums. Military expenditures have been cut back. It's been much less confident on the international stage, not just on security issues, but also on economic issues. That leadership has not been compensated for. The Europeans and the Japanese haven't substituted for American leadership, but neither have the Chinese or others. So China, while yes, it has been more assertive, even aggressive in East Asia and in other parts of the world, it's now trying to establish its own regional institutions, for example, a new BRICS bank and a bank for development to rival the ADB. Yet, when it comes to wider global leadership and participation in global institutions, the Chinese are still very much in reactive mode. They're not displaying the signs or the qualities of leadership, of taking initiative, of organizing coalitions, of providing public goods, the way the United States has done in the years of the Pax Americana. So what that leaves is a sort of power vacuum in the WTO, in the IMF, and elsewhere. The United States is not leading as it used to do, but that's not been compensated for by other powers either. So you have a situation or a climate of stasis and drift, and a general weakening of these international institutions. And not coincidentally, that's been accompanied by the rise of both bilateralism and regionalism. For example, these new free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements. So that brings me close to my conclusion, and I just want to ask a couple of questions. The first one is, what does all of this tell us about global governance today? And let me just ask a few questions. From today henceforward, is the United States capable of providing those international public goods? And these days, in a more multipolar environment, perhaps the more apposite question is the United States capable of organizing international cooperation to provide those international public goods? Does it have the willingness? Is its domestic political system willing and able to provide that kind of leadership it used to provide? What about other countries? Europe, the EU in particular, Japan, rising China, other big emerging market powers like India, Indonesia, and Brazil. How are they fitted for regional or indeed international leadership or co-leadership in this context of greater multipolarity? What about the reform of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank? What about newer issue areas for multilateral cooperation, such as climate change, energy, taxation, and so on? These are all big questions. In answering those questions, let me just paint two broad scenarios. There are the pessimists. The pessimists tend to come from the realist school of international relations, and they, borrowing on hegemonic stability theory, would argue that we are now back in a situation where there's a declining lead power, the United States. There are other powers rising, notably China, but no single power is capable of providing those international public goods. And what you have is rivalry and conflict between rising and emerging powers. And all of that conduces to instability, unpredictability in the world system on both the security side and the economic side. And the parallel they draw is with the late 19th century and early 20th century, when Britain was declining and the Americans, the Germans, and the Japanese were rising. And we saw how that ended. So this is, as I said, quite a pessimistic scenario. Some might not take it to its ultimate doomsday conclusion, but the outlook in this scenario is not good. The optimists, on the other hand, liberal optimists as it were, paint a different picture, and they say, for all the problems and the flaws in the global system today, if we compare it with what existed a century ago, we are in a much better position. Firstly, in terms of ideas. There are anti-market ideas out there, but the noxious ideologies that existed in 1913 of fascism, communism, the collectivist ideologies that coalesced into fascism and communism, National Socialism of the red variety or of the black variety, well, that was out there in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but much less so today. Secondly, interests. We have, back in the 19th century, there were a lot more protectionist interests. Now the world economy is more integrated, particularly through these global value chains. So there are more interests with a stake in an open world economy, and the interests who are protectionist are actually smaller, more constricted, less powerful than they used to be. Finally, institutions. The 19th century didn't have international institutions to manage conflict and change. The Americans set up these new institutions post-1945. They have their flaws, but they work in some respects. And they allow us to learn from our previous mistakes, not least the big policy mistakes that were made during the Great Depression. So there is institutionalized international cooperation out there, particularly to see us through crises. So for all these reasons, the liberal optimists would paint a better scenario of the continuation of a liberal international economic order in which rising powers such as China would be accommodated and would fit in. Very last question is whither globalization and global governance. So where are we going in the future? This is of course a crystal ball question. All I'm going to do here is give you three scenarios, very much congruent with the three paradigms of IPE that we discussed at the outset of this course. In the liberal scenario, we are heading for ever more globalization with ever more gains, broad-based, spread around the world. And this will be underpinned by reasonably strong multilateral cooperation and rules. For the free market types, it's very much about free markets at home, underpinned by negative rules, as we discussed earlier, both at home and abroad. For the more social democratic types, what they would hope for is a continuation, a refurbishment of the Smith abroad and Keynes at home compromise post-1945, where we see mixed economies at home alongside flexible cooperation and international organizations with various bureaucratic mechanisms abroad. There are, of course, the skeptics of markets and globalization. The extreme skeptics, Marxists, structuralists, dependencistas, would argue that the contradictions of capitalism are still there and will only get worse. It's an unjust system, and what we need is a radical break and radical reform. There are others, however, who are not as radical, who want to work within the present system more or less, but who are also very critical about the way markets and globalization work. Some of these are mainstream economists, like Danny Roderick at Harvard, like Joseph Stiglitz at Columbia, even like Martin Wolf of the Financial Times when it comes to the world's financial system. Roderick, I've got a couple of his readings on the reading list. His argument is that the earlier era of post-war cooperation was just about right because it was shallow. It didn't intrude too much on what national governments did. And national governments had broad leeway to intervene at home, and for developing countries, even to engage in quite a bit of protectionism against the outside world. What we saw from the 1980s, according to Roderick, is much more deregulation and globalization and more intrusive global governance, which has actually exacerbated the strains caused by inequality and has created more insecurity all around. So what he argues for is actually a lighter touch global governance that gives national governments much more leeway to intervene in markets in all sorts of ways and even to engage in some protectionism. That he would see as the better compromise between globalization, democracy, and national determination than what exists at the moment. So there we have our three different scenarios, and that's how I would answer that question by way of an a la carte menu, as it were. That's enough for today. Thank you.